All right, well, thanks everybody for being here. As you know, our task is we are creating an 80-foot mural on Fifth Street in Bellingham Square at the corner of Broadway and Fifth, right around the corner from McDonald's. And this is generously made possible by the people of Massachusetts through the Gaming Commission, bequeathed to us thanks to the Chelsea Cultural Council. And we engaged David Fichter to work his wonders to come up with a design for us. And after many months of research and conversations, he's ready to unveil his concept. So I'm going to leave it over to David. I invite folks to use the chat so that we can facilitate as much conversation along the way, or if you even just want to use it to take notes as you go. And then we'll kind of have a discussion for your feedback after he presents. All right, thank you, David.
All right, so I'm gonna, well, before I share screen, I think I'm just gonna, I just want to give you folks a little bit background about, first of all, thanks for coming and helping out on this, because it's everybody's suffering the side effects of their Moderna or their Pfizer vaccine. I myself, what happened to me was my eyes swelled up. So I actually, my eyes are very sore right now from it. But anyway, thank you for taking the time to be a part of this. Before I show you the preliminary design that I've put together, I just wanted to outline some of the research I've done over the last 6 months, just to kind of give you, since we had our last meetings back in July, I think July and August, our last Zoom meetings. And in the time after that, I decided to really spend a lot more time getting in depth about the history of Chelsea and learning about all the different organizations and people that have been, are kind of make Chelsea the special place that it is. So over the, one of the things that you folks were very clear about you wanted me to do after our last Zoom meeting was speak with the youth of Chelsea. So after that, we had a Zoom meeting with Chelsea youth from the high school, and then, which was a very useful meeting. And then I also specifically met with Chelsea youth of East African descent, primarily Somali. And then over a period of months, I met with, I'll just tell you a few of the people and organizations I met with. I met with Ellen, who's here today, Rodner, and Ed Medeiros, who really helped me to dig into the Jewish history in Chelsea. Ellen took me around to various sites, including Katz Bagels and the Temple Emmanuel. And I went into with Ed and spent a couple hours with him inside the Walnut Street synagogue. And then we've also had follow-up conversations. I also attended the Honduran Independence Day Festival and Parade and met separately with Margarita Franco to discuss Central American history in Chelsea. I've read a lot of the books on Chelsea history, including Turbulent Years in Chelsea and Sarah Gray Carey from Grenada to Chelsea, which is specifically about the Carey family, Chelsea in the 20th century, and a lot of other things. I also spent a week in the archives of the library to get more specific references, visual references about Chelsea, as well as read a lot of articles there. I met with Joan Cromwell and her family, who go back several generations in Chelsea, African-American family, and I attended BLM March, and I spent several hours with Leo Robinson and Ron Robinson, getting to understand in a deeper way the African-American community history in Chelsea. And I also met with some of the organizations. I met with Maria Bellin from Green Roots, who she may be here today. She was the last time, I think. And spent time in the community, several of the community gardens. I met with Gladys Vega and Daniele Paulino from the Collaborativa, and I also took pictures of all the various food drops. And in St. Luke's, I met with Father Luke and spent some time with him learning about the history of that church. And also talked to Elaine Mendez from the Revival International Center. And I spoke with Ron Fishman of Healthy Chelsea and I went on one, at least one of the walks with Healthy Chelsea and met people there. And these are just some of the various encounters I had to kind of learn about in more detail about what was important in the history of Chelsea. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is show you the design. So I'm going to share screen here. Hopefully this will, and what the heck? Okay. All right. So what I've done is, let me just get rid of this little thing. This is an overview of the design. You'll notice it's in black and white, but eventually it'll be in color. The very top of it will be a cutout all the way along the top. So you'll see a little bit of the brick coming through at the top edge. And this is the far left corner of Broadway and Fifth. And it starts here in the present and goes all the way back to the past to Native Americans and the American Revolution. So I'm going to go through that. It's going to take a little bit of depth in detail to kind of go over some of the details. But the working title for my mural design is Chelsea Resilient, Call and Response Through the Ages. And the overall mural traces the rich history of Chelsea from its beginnings as a Native American community called Winnesimmet, whose peoples used to fish and dig mussels on the banks of the Chelsea Creek, to the very present community efforts to ameliorate the effects of the pandemic through community cooperation and action. During the past 4 centuries, Chelsea as a community has undergone calamities and drastic events to which the community has responded with organized and united action to help each other and rebuild. During each period, new immigrants have made Chelsea their home, transformed it, and kept it alive. It is part of the character of the city as it has transformed over the centuries right up to the present to respond to adversity with collaboration and as Father Edgar's sense of taking care of each other. In my design, which roughly follows a timeline from the present on the left to the past on the right, this call and response, I just got lost in my words here. This call and response theme is illustrated throughout the history of Chelsea. And now I'm gonna. All right, this is the far right side, which goes back into the 18th and 17th centuries. And it begins with an image illustrated, begins on the far right with images of the famous Battle of Chelsea Creek, which is the first naval battle of the American Revolution in May of 1775, just before the Battle of Bunker Hill in nearby Charlestown. The American revolutionaries had managed to disable a foundering British warship, the Diana, remove its cannons and other valuables and set it on fire. Famously, right on the at the edge of Chelsea today. Famously, Revolutionary War General Israel Putnam, who's depicted here on the right, waded into the water of Chelsea Creek up to his waist to call out to the British to surrender. And when they refused to, which they refused to do so. So the mural begins with Putnam calling out across the ages, standing in the water of Chelsea Creek, next to one of the American cannons that were used in the battle, while the Diana burns. In the smoke of the burning Diana, you see a map of the town in the 18th century with locations for the scenes of the naval battle. And to the left of this ship burning is a scene of Native American women who are digging mussels on the shores of Chelsea Creek. And just above Putnam's cannon, right down here, is a portrait of Fanny Fairweather, a slave of the Carey family who lived much of her life in Chelsea and died in Chelsea, I think around 1844. Her inclusion in the mural is important to telling the full story of slavery, which is found in New England as well as in the South. And although there isn't an actual portrait created at the time, a lot is known about the character and life of Fanny, and her actual house is still in existence. I depict her in her older years with a favorite cat on her lap, a book to represent the fact that she learned to read, and her parrot perched on the cannon. She's also smoking a pipe, which she was known to do. Above her is a representation of the Carey House, the oldest standing building in Chelsea, I believe. To the left of Fanny, let me just get a little closer. To the left of Fanny is a standing portrait of Helen Louise Gilson. Helen was the niece of the first mayor of Chelsea, Mayor Francis B. Fay, who was elected shortly after the Chelsea became a city in the mid-19th century. Helen lived with Mayor Fay and took care of his kids, actually, I think. And during the Civil War, at a young age, answered to the call for nurses in the Civil War. And she became a Civil War nurse on the Union side, who was known as one of the few nurses who would take care of African-American soldiers. After the war, she returned to Chelsea and was married, but died in childbirth. Okay, let me just go here. To the left of Helen Gilson is a portrait of Lewis Howard Latimer, a mid-19th century African-American inventor who grew up in Chelsea and eventually went on to work with Edison, developing plans for various light bulbs, as well as drawing up patent drawings for Alexander Graham Bell. His father was an escaped slave who found refuge in Chelsea after a pretty harrowing escape, where he was recognized on Boston Common, locked up, but eventually was freed by Boston abolitionists. Behind Latimer and Gilson is an image of 19th century Chelsea Square during the trolley era. You can see the Chelsea Courthouse on the left, as well as the Stebbins Fountain. To the left of Latimer is a representation of the industrial era in Chelsea, with images of the Chelsea Clock Building, as well as a large Chelsea clock in Bellingham Square, and a female worker helping to assemble a clock. There are other manufacturing plants in the background, including the Maggie Furnace Company, which was located on Chelsea Creek. Just as an aside, there are a lot of different industries at that time in Chelsea, and I wasn't able to, would have loved to put them all in, but it would have been way too much detail. There are other, below the Chelsea Clock Building in the foreground are two young Polish-American girls from the Chelsea Pulaski Festival in Chelsea Square, and a Cam Frankfurter wagon, horse-drawn, with the founder of Cam, a Polish immigrant, and I'm going to botch his pronunciation of his name, but it was Kazimierz Monkiewicz, driving the horse. So that's this guy here on the wagon. To the left of the industrial era, let me just go here, is a large-scale image of an early 20th century newsboy calling out as he hawks newspapers. In one hand, he holds an April 13th, 1908 edition of the newspaper with headlines about the Chelsea fire that devastated the city. There are images of Chelsea people lining up for assistance, which mirrors the later images of today with people lining up for assistance from the pandemic, as well as images showing destruction of the churches, including St. Rose and St. Stanislaus by the fire on either side. In his other hand, the newsboy holds up a Chelsea Record newspaper in October '73 with when a second fire again destroyed much of Chelsea. And behind the newsboy, behind the newsboy's shoulder over here is a scene of Chelsea firemen fighting the 1973 fire. To the left of the newsboy, there are a series of images primarily representing the Chelsea Jewish community. The next image of the call and response theme is illustrated by a Jewish woman blowing a shofar, a ram's horn blown at New Year and Rosh Hashanah, in a section that highlights the period when Chelsea was predominantly a Jewish community with approximately 22 synagogues. The synagogue depicted below is the Walnut, is the Walnut Street Synagogue, which is one of several remaining active temples. It was rebuilt right after the 1908 fire. Above the woman blowing the shofar is a representation of Katz Bagels, one of the still thriving Jewish businesses in Chelsea. Richard Katz, who carries on in the 70-year tradition of his father, is shown making the pizza bagel, which his father invented in the 1970s. And below, on the left, is an image of the beloved Jewish delicatessen Murray and Eddie's, with two of the brothers standing in front of their eccentric menu board, and a corned beef sandwich and matzo ball soup on the counter. To the right, in front of the Walnut Street Synagogue, is a group of Chelsea Puerto Rican kids eating ice cream that they got from a neighborhood truck during the 1970s. To the left of Murray and Eddie's scene is a large-scale image of a Latin American child being raised up by many different hands. And this is to represent the community coming together to secure the future. Above the baby is a woman making pupusas on the left, traditional Salvadoran food. And behind her are members of the Chelsea Somali community in traditional clothing. A young girl to the right of this group, just below the shofar, is carrying the Torah. The scene to the left of the baby being raised up takes place within the shape and fold of a Salvadoran traditional dancer. Out of the folds of her dress come images of the Chelsea community today. On the far left, where the dress has a blue stripe, are images of Chelsea Creek with kayakers from Green Roots and with the Tobin Bridge in the background. At the bottom of the swirl of the dress are gardeners from several different Chelsea community gardens. And to the right, coming out of the inner swirl of the dress, are images of Chelsea groups and organizations today, including La Colaborativa, responding to the COVID pandemic crisis with food distributions to needy citizens of Chelsea. Above this, so I have to go back to show this, but up here above the shoulder of the dancer is the image of the beloved water tower from the Chelsea Soldiers' Home. And to the left, there's the quetzal bird, which is unique and special to Central America, and especially in Guatemala, which flies up and over the scene, alluding to both the arrival of more recent immigrants to Chelsea, but also to the idea of the phoenix rising from the ashes to represent the revival and reinvention of the city. The bird is symbolic of rebirth, hope, renewal, progress, and the end of oppression. Finally, let me just go here. Okay, finally, the beginning of the mural represents youth in the present, focused on the future and the desire for change, an aspiration strongly communicated to me during my Zoom session with Chelsea high school students. On the left is a young Honduran American man blowing a conch shell, which is both a traditional musical instrument found throughout Central and South America, as well as in Asia. And paired with the conch shell player is a young African-American woman calling out with a megaphone during a protest march. Symbolically, her megaphone, along with the conch shell, calls out across the whole vast time span of Chelsea history, echoing the Jewish woman blowing the shofar, the newsboy calling out the news about the fires, to the American Revolutionary War General Israel Putnam calling out during the Battle of Chelsea Creek. It links the past with the present and a continuous call and response, which has historically defined the unique character of the city of Chelsea. So let me just. So that's the end of my presentation about the details of the design. So I think what would be great to do now, I'm going to stop sharing, is to kind of discuss your reactions and get feedback and thoughts of all sorts. The next stage after this, and any changes or additions that I make, would be to add color to it and enlarge it onto the panels. It's going to be painted onto panels, and then in my studio, and then those panels will be installed on the wall. You probably noticed that the shape of the wall is not just a straight shape. So it has a very irregular top. And to do what I'll do when I actually take the panels, I will cut that out with a saw so it will have an irregular cutout, which is something I've done in other murals. And I'm just trying to think of some other things that you might have questions about. I think that's it. I think we should dig in now, and I can bring up the screen if there's a particular image you want to look at and talk about in detail. So you want to,
David, you could probably see that Ellen is raising her hand. You can see there's like a little blue hand, so that's how you can call on people.
All right. So Ellen, we saw your hand first.
Okay, well, David, first of all, it's spectacular. I think it's fabulous. I mean, I've learned a lot just from seeing your mural, a lot about Chelsea that I hadn't known before. I think it's great. I do have, and I thank you for including, I think, some really wonderful images of Jewish Chelsea. But I do have a problem with your using female, this sounds crazy because I consider myself a feminist, but using females for the shofar blowers and carrying the Torah. In fact, I think when we spoke before, I told you that at the time when Chelsea was really very much a Jewish community, women would never be in that position. It's a totally patriarchal tradition that has only changed in about the last 30 or 40 years, much of it after the Jewish community had left. I did, in fact, speak with a woman this morning who grew up in Chelsea and lived there for many years, and was bat mitzvahed at the Shirtliff Street Synagogue in like I think in the late 70s. And she told me, it was really interesting because she told me that, and her grandparents were here, they lived in a 3-family house till well into the 2000s. She told me that while she had a bat mitzvah, which means you read from the Torah, she was not allowed to go up in front of the Torah. She had to stand on the side. She was not allowed to carry it, which is like an honor that a person gets. In those days, really, except for the very progressive arms of Judaism, which never existed in Chelsea, it was always men doing all that. So the fact that there are 2 women, I think, is kind of interesting, but it does not resonate at all with the Jewish history.
Well, you and I have talked about this
before,
in detail, so not everybody else is privy to our discussion.
Right.
The Torah image I actually took from Temple Emmanuel's Facebook site of a young girl.
Later, but that's much later. I mean, there is a Jewish community in Chelsea now that exists primarily in memory. There are some people, it's not as significant, it's significant for people who remember, who have been here for many years, but it's not a significant community as the way it was, in the in the 20th century, early to mid 20th century. And I think that your mural reflecting that history is some way, it's kind of unusual, or people will note that, wow, there were never women doing that in Shul, that never happened. Just whereas now I think, yeah, it does happen and it's great, but it didn't happen in the day when there were 18 to 22 synagogues in Chelsea. Never.
Right. No, I understood that when I did it. I mean, part of what I was doing is looking to the future or the present and the future, and also when things have changed, obviously. And also I'm trying to balance out the number of, balance out the mural gender-wise, I guess we would say. So it isn't just a reflection of men, right, and men's history.
Right.
Because
well, there were Jewish women who served politically on the school committee, say, in the 1920s. There were women who were very active in the community, but that's another thing. But religiously speaking, women were involved in the sisterhood. They were raising money. They were doing a lot. They were teaching children, but they were not part of the religious ritual.
Okay, so the next hand up is Matt and then Lisa.
So I put part of my comments, oh, there we go. I put part of my comments in the comments, but the French Canadian portion of the north part of the Chelsea somehow completely got eclipsed. Like the church up on Broadway on the north side was they called it the French Church, Our Lady of Assumption. There was the French Club, which is now a building. And most of Mill Hill was essentially either Polish mill workers or French Canadian mill workers. So I'm not sure if there's a way to kind of just incorporate something along those lines, because there was a pretty significant portion of that part of town. They unfortunately weren't really big fans of government or those other things, so they kept to themselves in their own kind of community on the north side of town. So they are often overlooked. But it was a pretty significant population, and there's still a lot of people who still live on that part of town who are French Canadian, or at least part French Canadian.
I'm just taking it. Do you know of, I mean, I haven't run into that in any of the books or anything, so I'm a little bit of a lost for visual references and things, you know, like if there was a French Canadian worker or something like that in one of the industry factories. I assume that happened a lot. Is there any kind of reference material that you know about that you could direct me to around that?
I could look around. So for me, it's mostly just kind of just knowing the people, like the Richard family, the Richards family, the DeVoe family. I could name probably 10 to 15 different families that literally are still there and they're still around. And going back to like at least 1905, when my great grandfather, Matthew Richard, lived up on Broadway. They've been living there since recently that house got
And
sold.
what do you know what your great grandfather did? Did he have a business?
I'd have to look into it. I don't know if he would be the representation that you would want. But I can ask around. I'm being perfectly honest. A lot of people I don't think like them. I know it's being recorded and it's going to condemn me to hell, but I'm not advocating specifically for somebody like him. But I could ask some of my family members and other people I know who would be a good representation. But your safer bet might be more of a building, like the old Our Lady of Assumption, which was the French church, or the old French club, which is now the Arcadia. That would be much easier to prove and much easier to kind of document, because there are pictures of it. And the French club actually had a very significant, had a logo that was pretty.
Was that destroyed in the fire, or was it rebuilt?
No, we never got touched on that side of the town. They never really got touched by the fires. Both fires avoided that part. Like we're talking like the Revere portion, actually where the Diana sunk essentially. Most of those houses, nothing up there really got touched by the fires.
What was it? You'd say Our Lady of Assumption. What was the other church you mentioned?
I mentioned the French club. It was a social club. And that was down on Broadway, at Broadway and Spencer.
All right. Well, anything you can, you know, I can certainly find the churches. I don't know about the French club, but
I can help you with that, David. There's some stuff I can get you.
okay.
But people-wise, I'm not sure if there's like a significant like person that would represent.
Well, did they work in
pretty quickly?
Did they work in often people came and worked in specific industries.
Yeah, so Mill Hill used to be all mills, and they're all now condos now. So there was like the Buster Brown Shoe Company. They also made elastic bands for underwear at one point. There was Demerco, the chemical place, where a lot of people worked. There were a lot of chemical places actually. Might not be the best thing for your mural, but there were a lot of factories down in that neighborhood. And a lot of them are currently condos.
And Forbes.
Oh yeah, Forbes, of course. A lot of people over at Forbes.
I chose to go with sort of Chelsea clock as a main image, and then I have some images of Forbes. I tried it out. It just design wise, the other one worked better because it was an easier design. It was the furnace company. I think it's called Maggie.
Well, the
But
thing,
yeah,
I don't know if Forbes kind of would represent the French Canadian community anyway.
yeah. No, it just represents one of the major industries. I mean, to some extent, I had to make choices in terms of the industries. I know there are a lot of, in that period, and choose one or two that kind of stood for all the others. And that's what I did. And since Chelsea Clock still exists, KM meat processing still exists. And Forbes is, I think there's a building still there, but I don't think they exist anymore. I just chose to go with them, but that was kind of I don't know, just somewhat of a random choice based on what
I could ask around to see if we have a historian figure that would be able to help represent. I could ask around.
Yeah, sure, that would be great. Or I can probably find some images based on what you've told me too. But anything you can do to help is because I just hadn't run into a lot about it.
Well, like I said, they kept to themselves up on the north side of town. Actually, when I ran for city council, a lot of my relatives were like, "You don't want to deal with City Hall. You don't want City Hall." I'm like, "What's wrong with City Hall?"
We don't want them to know we're here.
Well, there's a severe distrust, and anybody who's dealt with my people that are related to me or other the French Canadians from Mill Hill at public meetings would probably tell you that there's a severe distrust of the government.
So next to speak is Lisa and then Eduardo.
Okay, David, I love the call and response. I think to have that on both sides and tie it all together is really like a lovely device. And like Matt, my family was Sicilian, and there were many Sicilian Americans, many from the same villages that came here after the earthquake in 1908. And one of the stories that I've heard often from many Sicilian relatives in Chelsea, many of whom settled on the waterfront, because that was really tenement living. And also the more affluent Italians moved to Prattville. And you can see, for example, on Garfield Ave, some of the people who were masons and bricklayers, their craft was represented in their homes. So a lot of the Italians who kind of made it moved to the other side of town, and you can just see the beautiful work that they did. But one of the things that people talk about a lot when we're sitting around were the vendors who also called out a lot in the city. And there is a famous one who was Italian, and the joke is that he would call out picciola, picciola for peaches. So that's been a lot of family lore. And I love the idea of vendors and calling and responding, because I think there were many, and they were Sicilian American and Italian American. And I believe that at that time it was basically at the turn of the century was Jewish and Italian. Ellen can probably help me with that history. Oh, you're on mute, Ellen.
Ellen, mute.
We can't hear you.
There should be a sign for that.
There you are.
Okay, Ellen, we
Hi.
couldn't hear you.
I just want to add to what Lisa was saying is, my grandparents settled, and great-grandparents and grandparents settled in Chelsea, and my grandfather, who was a Jewish immigrant, one of my grandfathers who was a Jewish immigrant from Russia, always in the summer would offer me watermelon, and he always pronounced it watermeloni, because that's what he heard from the Italian vendors, watermeloni, watermeloni. And I've heard stories from Jewish women saying that Italian vendors helped them taught them how to pickle watermelon rinds, which, they had no idea that ever existed. And also growing up in Chelsea in the mid in the mid 20th century. I have to honestly say that everybody I knew was Jewish, Irish, Italian, or Polish. And I didn't realize until I was in college that Protestants were the majority in this country. I just thought everybody's Jewish, Irish, Italian, or Polish. And mostly, I lived in Prattville in the Bremer Road projects, and it was mostly Italian, Jews, and Poles, and Irish. So I was surprised also not to see greater Irish or Italian representation. And I can remember, Lisa, you may, I'm sure, have more vivid memories than I, but I can remember people having, great vines in their backyards and, always with statues in front of their houses. I mean,
Yes,
it was very,
definitely. And tomatoes in the
tomatoes,
garden.
yeah, it was very, very typical of walking down a street anywhere in Chelsea and seeing that.
And I think a lot of the people worked in the factories. My grandmother made laundry bags. My great grandmother worked at Chelsea Clock, as did my grandfather. So I think that the Sicilian and Italian population was represented in the workforce in the factories and in the industry as well.
So Eduardo, you had your hand up. Do you have something to contribute?
Yes, no, well, David, first of all, it looks amazing. I think as I saw it, it just gave me even more of a reason to be proud of being a part of Chelsea. I guess what I have, the questions I have is why the reason people like like John Reese, Chick Corea, or Marion Oswood, Anna Chrissy Fall, why people like that were not put in the mural. I love the fact that Lewis Latimer's there, because it's not a lot of people know about him, and but just thinking about all these other amazing people, just what was the reason they were not a part of the mural?
So I mean, I know Chick Corea, and I just sort of ran out of room. I really wanted to put him. And by the way, he was Italian American, so that would be a great connection. And he just has a wonderful face, and I love to paint portraits, as you know. So I am still struggling to try to figure out where to put him in, for sure. And I didn't know who are the other people. Oh, the boxer, is that who you mentioned?
John Reese, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And Marion Oswood and Anna Chrissy Fall. I mean, there's a lot of people, but that's just like the people that come to my mind. And unfortunately, I didn't learn about all of these people and all the people you have in your mural when I was growing up as a kid here. Not until I became an adult. So, but just thinking about these people, I mean, it really makes this community really, I think, important, because all these people came out of here, so I don't know, just thinking about, and also just thinking about just just women in the community, Marion Oswood and Anna Chrissy Fall. I think that they have they definitely should be represented, and I think that, again, those are people that not a lot of people think about, when thinking about the history of Chelsea. But other than that, amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, my only response would be, I had to make choices, because obviously I couldn't put every single person in that is either well-known or famous or important. And as I told you, I also wanted to put in people who were not famous too, which is something I did. And as Chelsea has such a rich history and so many different aspects of it. And although I felt like I made a good stab at understanding a lot of the history, I obviously didn't get wasn't able to cover everything. And so that's sort of where that was at.
And and totally understandable. It just means that we need another wall. We need more. We need another mural. So to be continued.
It's a long wall. It's just not that long, and it's 400 years.
Carl has his hand up.
Unmute. Okay. The one piece that I was surprised to not see was the Navy. Well, there's been a naval hospital here for a century and a half until Nixon took revenge on Massachusetts for not voting for him. And that was kind of a big, it's now Admiral's Hill, but for most of Chelsea's history, it was a Marine hospital and a Navy hospital. And there were also a Marine hospital down on the Chelsea Creek waterfront for a while, and then it got combined and moved over to Admiral's Hill. So, the soldiers' home, you kind of got in there with the water tower, but that's another, kind of, that was iconic in Chelsea long before they put the water tower up. So, just a couple of parts of our history.
Yeah, no, the Naval Hospital and the Marine Hospital, I certainly am well aware of, and especially going all the way back to, the 18th century. And I just, again, it's the same thing I just said about trying to figure out how to focus things and maintain a kind of so it doesn't become a lot of mush. So that's why some things are really big, some things are small. It wasn't even necessarily based on importance. It was really based on a kind of Mimi's heard me tell this. I use the metaphor of meatballs and spaghetti, and since we've been talking about Italian Americans, that's a good one. The meatballs are the visual anchors, and they're the things that kind of lock in on the design, and then the spaghetti is all the little details that if you didn't have the meatballs, you'd have an imbalance, and it would just become like a Jackson Pollock painting or something. Lots of swirling things, images, but no focus. But yeah, some of those things I could easily see I can get in. They probably would be small on the more detail side. I have places that I can think of doing that. Another thing that I really I wanted to put in was the ferry, the Chelsea ferry that went for several hundred years between Boston and I had a hard time figuring out where I could put that. I don't know how important it was.
That's what led to Winnissimmet becoming a village.
Yeah.
That's the anchor of Chelsea's pre-revolutionary history.
Yeah. All right. Are there other hands up? I can't see.
Yeah, it was the start of the Salem Turnpike.
Right. And there were other things that I really valued, but again, like the Slade Spice Mill, which is still there. It's the last, the only tidal mill in New England, as far as I know. And I've actually painted it into other murals. It's technically not in Chelsea now, but at one time it was, when Chelsea included Revere and other, went further north. The Slade Spice Mill? I assume you do.
Oh yeah, on Mill Creek. We're trying to get rid of the dam remnants.
Well, there's probably going to be a lot. I would imagine a lot of things will be changed right around that area. So are there other questions or thoughts or feedbacks that
We haven't heard from you yet,
who?
from Lee.
Okay. Wait, I think I've done. Am I able to be heard?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. No, I thought it was terrific. I loved, I can appreciate the difficulty of putting 400 years into such a small space because Chelsea history is so rich. But I love the way, you know, you bookended Israel, Putnam, and the megaphone from today. And I thought it was a, you know, wonderful balance of the really staying with the theme of resilience and rising to challenges that, you know, we had talked about in the very beginning. So I was blown away by it, frankly. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
And Mimi, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I agree with Lee. I really loved it. I thought the theme was good. I really liked it. I loved it. I really did. I understand it's really hard. There's nothing political about it, and I'm a very political person, so, but otherwise, I get why you wouldn't want to go there. So, no, beautiful, really spectacular.
Well, Chelsea was the center of union organizing too.
Right, and you know, so it's one mural. I agree. You need more.
Chelsea was, there was a Chelsea Labor Lyceum into, I don't know, maybe the 60s or I
Yeah,
don't,
right across from City Hall.
that's right, on Broadway, and until the building was torn down. But it was often, it was the site of a lot of political work, protests. It was open to, it was formed by the Workmen's Circle in Boston, Jewish Workmen's Circle, but then it was just open to all the immigrants, and people would come to get advice on to get health care, to get food, to organize, because everybody worked in factories, you know. But that was really prominent. I don't know whether anybody's done a lot of research on the labor movements in Chelsea, because I think it's just really fascinating to just do that history alone.
That
So
sounds
the
like
folks that haven't spoken, does anybody want to chime in? Now's your chance. I know some folks have been messaging me privately and then using the chat, but Ben, Brandon, Carolina, Janelle, Dave.
I'm all set. I think it looks amazing. The detail is just incredible, and I think it really tells a great story. So
I think it's fabulous, and it's just how you're always, I mean, the wall just isn't long enough to include every significant piece of Chelsea's history. So yeah, there do have to be choices made, and maybe some of these other things can be squeezed in, but overall, I really was very impressed.
So David, what are our next steps from here?
Well, I think so. I'm gonna absorb. I'm taking notes, absorbing everything everybody said. I think a big thing. Maybe I need to have a conversation with you, Ellen, just in particular to resolve some of those things without having to make changes. Obviously, I could change the person playing the shofar to a man. And if that's really important to you, I think I would do that. I mean, I like the idea of it being a woman because it looks to the future. But obviously I'm learning a lot. I'm learning everything from you, so I can't really make that choice on my own, or the group, I guess we could say. So that would be one thing. And then finding some imagery that will help with the French Canadian and the Italian American presence will help me. If anybody, I assume everybody has my email address. So, and maybe Mimi, you can help connect me with any resources on that. You know, the other things that people brought up, I mean, I really would like to put Chick Corea, and I forget who brought him up. And he was his father was, I don't know where does anybody know where his father came from? I read it somewhere and now I've forgotten. He might have come around the early 20th century, around the time that people have been talking about. But, and he's really internationally known and beloved. So, and recently passed away, I mean. So anyway, those are, but I think in terms of the big picture, I'm hoping we can keep the main idea going, and we're talking more about details here to change. And then I guess, I don't know, Mimi, if you want to, I guess the next stage will be for me to add color after I make those kind of adaptions based on what people have told me, and then be ready to rock and roll. And then have to make it. So in case people didn't realize, I'm going to be painting it on aluminum panels that will then be installed on the wall. So it won't be done right on the. And the reason for that is, my understanding is the reason for that is because the city doesn't own the building, and we want to have the ability to protect it if for some reason it changes ownership or something like that. Is that correct, Mimi?
Yeah, and just so the property owner, you know, has some options about, you know, wanting to stave the mural and also maybe, you know, put windows back in there or whatever. Keeps our options open. It gives you a nice smooth wall, and you can work in your studio meticulously over the next couple months.
All right, well, that is also part. But I painted a lot of murals on site, so it's not new, wouldn't be new for me. All right, well, just seeing that there's a couple more. Anything else? Anybody else wants, has occurred to them as we've, and Mimi, I don't know if you want a way to show, I mean, I know you've shown it to a couple people who were key players in helping us learn about the city, like the librarian, Sarah. I think you've shown it to her.
Yeah, I showed it to Sarah, I showed it to B, I showed it to Leo. So I think we'll, maybe once you get to the color portion and make some edits, we'll kind of, some of the, you know, city councilor, make sure Dave Tregorth, who owns the property, you know, give him a lot of say. Tom's going to be our final seal of approval as we go along, but you know, I think I really appreciate how much you've integrated and somehow absorbed so many pieces of spaghetti and meatballs, and to be all these ingredients that you've been able to put forward to us. So thank you so much for being really open and taking in the feedback that you've gotten along, and listening so closely to so many people in our community. It really is showing in the depth of thought and how you've captured our spirit so beautifully. So thank you so much, David.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Great.
David.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Mimi, will you be able to save
Thank
the stuff from the chat so we can? So
Yes,
can,
I will save that, and I've taken notes, and I will send that off to you, and we'll have this recorded too, so you can reflect on it afterwards.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.